All right, so this is part 2 of the story of the tariffs that caused Pearl Harbor. So what happened was when Japan got cut out of their share of the global trade, really, in light of the tariffs that were passed, the Hoot-Smalley tariffs, and they couldn't figure out any other way to get the trade that they needed or even send their imports out. That's, as I mentioned, when they became imperialist. So after Japan became imperialist again, they started looking around for where to imperialize, like where were they gonna invade? And of course they teamed up with Hitler and they became the Axis powers. And they went ham over in the Philippines. So, you know, we sort of ignored that. But we had this one little base out in the middle of the ocean there on Hawaii that it wasn't even a state yet, because it didn't become a state until it was like 1950s. But, you know, we had a military presence there. And it seems, according to Professor Payne, that once Japan started having some successes and they were like not seeing much of a response from either Europe or the United States, they were starting to feel themselves. They looked at that base out there and they realized, hey man, those guys are pretty close to the areas that we are in the process of taking over, and it threatened them. And so they thought, we're going to go out there and bop them on the paw, because they are getting awfully close to the areas where we have territorial interests, and they need to be taught a lesson. And that, along with kind of the honor culture of Japan, that once you commit to a thing, you don't back down, because you bring shame upon your family and they bring shame upon their family and their family's family. That loyalty was all also kicked in, because, you know, they were already suffering because of the fact that they were getting much less of what they needed and their economy was failing. And so it was like, well, if we're going to invest all of this, you know, it's a sunk cost fallacy there, then it better be worth something. So they thought they were going to come out and ding us, and that would curb our interests in Hawaii. And so that's why they flew out and bombed Pearl Harbor. And there's an argument to be made that if they had not done that, we would have just sat around letting Hitler take over the rest of Europe. I don't know if that's 100% true. It's a what if question. But it is interesting to think about. Like, we were just like, yeah, well, good luck with all that. As like fascists just started to take over entirely and threaten democratic nations. And the thing about it is that none of that would have happened if it hadn't been for the Japanese economy getting cratered. Now, you can't just say that the economy out there got cratered just because of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. It's not just that. But it sure didn't help when they were already under pressure and really dependent on import and export as a part of how they were keeping up with the Joneses in Japan. And then, after Pearl Harbor, we were pissed off. They had poked the bear. And it was at that point that FDR put his plan into gear. And we were in suddenly a war footing. Now, he also had the ability, because of the war, to start implementing some of his more broad-reaching ideas because there was a huge rush of patriotic fever to get the Japs back. And that's a lot of the reason that our manufacturing just cranked into overdrive. And then that is why we were able to build ourselves out of the Great Depression. Because I know I learned that in school, and I always thought, like, how do you do that? How do you seem so bad? How do you build yourself out of a depression? That's why, folks, they stopped with the tariffs and they started with manufacturing and sending as much as they could over to Europe, in part to prepare them for the boots on the ground they were going to send, as well as just to keep them afloat so that Hitler just didn't swallow them whole. Once we got involved, we had the additional benefit, which I hadn't thought about, of being able to produce things on our land without having to be bombed the whole time. So when World War II came to its inevitable end, we were the only power out there with a huge functioning manufacturing base. That's how we became a global superpower, people, because all their factories were bombed as shit. So we used our factories to build their factories. And if you'll notice, as soon as Japan was whacked flat with all kinds of stuff, including nuclear bombs, they came right back into the maritime order. And that was the other thing that Professor Payne pointed to. She said it was easier to rebuild them, it was easier to rebuild Germany because they had been industrial and industrial minded, and they literally were just having this weird historical hiccup in the case of Germany, and of course also the fact that they lost World War I and the Versailles treaties that basically hobbled them as a punishment essentially for starting the war. At least that was the impression that the winners had. And it really gave a lot of room for a demagogue like Hitler to take root and start making points. Word to the wise, all this protectionism stuff caused worse problems. It had unintended consequences, and we spent a long time digging out of that hole. Now, we benefited from that the last time, but that was basically just luckiness. If we'd had ever a ground war here, we'd be in the same boat as Europe after the bombings, right? Or the land invasions. It's just luck. And that's how tariffs caused the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor.